Coming to you live from Radio Cayman Studio.
For the record.
For the record. Hear from your government officials, independents, and the opposition on issues that matter to you. The record. Engage in an open dialogue between residents and lawmakers.
For the record.
The record. Informative, impartial, insightful.
This is your talk show.
1-800-534-8255. Your calls, your input. This is For the Record. And now, your host, Orit Connor.
Good morning and welcome to For the Record. Today is Wednesday, the 4th day of April, 2018. It has been one week since I have been on For the Record because of the holiday. Of course, For the Record is on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. So after last week, Wednesday, we had Good Friday, and then, of course, we had Easter Monday as well. But I trust that everyone enjoyed the break that they had. There are some people who are still on break, and we trust that you're enjoying it as well. Traffic has been light on the road. That is as a result also of schools being out, and we want to urge drivers out there to drive cautiously as well, because there's less traffic. Should not be any reason for you to speed on the roads as well. Today, the 4th of April, 50 years since the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King as well. And those of you who are in line with the civil rights movement in the U.S. or worldwide, certainly I'm sure, I know that you have a certain amount of reverence and for this day and respect for Dr. Martin Luther King as well. I recall 1967, 68, my first trip to the U.S., a gentleman who was well known in the Cayman Islands at that point in time. I think he was a former politician then as well. And he said to me, you're going up to the United States, make sure you don't get involved with those black people up there who are rioting and demonstrating and everything else. And, he made reference to Dr. Martin Luther King as well. Goes to show you some of the thinking of some of our people here in the Cayman Islands. And there are still people today in the Cayman Islands who believe that the black movement in the United States of America is not something that needs to be supported. But we're now discovering that that movement of persons, people of color, is not just restricted to the United States now, but it is a worldwide phenomenon as well. So with those few words of introduction, and I'd like to extend my condolences for those families who lost family members during the holiday period as well, and to those of you who have had birthdays during that period of time. Want to wish you a happy birthday as well. And one in particular, Miss Juanita, want to wish her belated happy birthday as well. And I want to thank you, our listening and viewing audience, for allowing Radio Cayman and by extension For the Record into your homes, into your vehicles as you traverse the not so busy roads of the Cayman Islands today, into your places of work, whether it be an office cubicle or if you're working in the outdoors. Of course, For the Record is a show produced by the staff and the management of Radio Cayman, and it is geared towards keeping you abreast of issues as they arise and play out on the local, regional, and international scene. I am your host, Orit Connor, and you're welcome to join me every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 7:30 a.m. until 9:30 a.m. During those days, our phone lines are always open, and there's always someone there waiting to take your calls. And you haven't heard this phrase in a while as well. Normally, it is that beautiful radio voice of Miss Susan Watson, who was on vacation for a while, and she's right back with us now, railing to go, nice and chirpy. And we must say that we did miss her, and I'm sure that a lot of her fans have expressed that sentiment as well. So There's always someone there waiting to take your calls. Normally, it's that beautiful radio voice of Miss Susan Watson. You can call us on our toll-free number provided courtesy of Flo. That toll-free number is 1-800-534-8255. You can also call us on 949-8037 and 949-6990. Of course, if you don't like to talk on the telephone, then email us at For The Record. That is one word, For The Record, at candw.ky. In addition to that, we have our WhatsApp number. That number is 925-3261, where you can leave a voice note or send us a text message as well. If you leave a voice note, that voice note will be played during the course of the show as well. We have no guest in the studio this morning. I expect to have a guest later on between now and the news time, at the end of the news at around 8:15. After that, we expect to have Mr. Billy Adam join us in the studio, and we have several things to talk about. I was fortunate to have Mr. Billy Adam refer me to a colleague of his in Anguilla, Mr. Sutcliffe Hodge, and he's the owner and the host of a radio talk show in Anguilla. And last night, I was invited along with Mr. Billy Adams and representatives from the Turks and Caicos, from the BVI, and Anguilla as well, including the Honorable Don Mitchell, to discuss issues about the overseas territories on that radio show. And we want to continue that discussion this morning with Mr. Billy Adams when he comes in. Some of the things that we talked about on that show, and we want to continue to discuss some of those issues here this morning as well. They include the fact that some of the topics that were discussed, the UK's response to natural disasters in the overseas territories. And of course, that is something that is currently ongoing in the overseas territories as well, when we consider the disasters that we had last year in September of last year as well. So that was one of the topics that I discussed. The other one was the UK's demand for fiscal prudence. And the question was, is that demand for fiscal prudence in the overseas territories unreasonable? And whether or not that should be tied to aid as well. Another topic was, is independence a better option for the overseas territories? Has the overseas territories' political leaders failed to prudently manage the respective islands? Are there issues of corruption and conflict of interest affecting or plaguing the overseas territories? Does the UK government have an obligation to put in the enabling infrastructure to ensure sustainability in the overseas territory? And one of the final topics that we discussed was, what are the skill sets required to successfully manage the overseas territories in this era in 2018 and moving forward as well? And so these were all discussed on that talk show last night. I think the host has promised to provide us with copies of the discussion as well, and hopefully at some point in time maybe we can provide you with the contents of that by playing some of it here, either on For the Record or if Radio Cayman can accommodate that as well. But it was a very insightful discussion to have. So when Mr. Billy Adam comes on the show after the 8 o'clock news, we will continue to discuss this. The other things that we want to discuss as well is that quite recently, video has been circulating about issues in Barbados. We see the issue arising in the Turks and Caicos as well, and it is quite prominent here in the Cayman Islands. Has to do with beach access and what portions of the beach are considered to be for public use as opposed to private use as well. That video has been circulated wide and far throughout the Cayman Islands. I am trusting and hoping that those persons who have viewed this and have circulated it are not doing it for the entertainment purposes of it, but are taking quite seriously the issues that are facing the inhabitants of these islands when they are confronted by such serious issues where we're pitting our local people against the tourists, against the tourism industry, because we can't find common ground. We can place the blame at several sources. We know here in the Cayman Islands, for instance, that this whole issue of the high water mark, it was not always that way. It was changed by a particular politician who had a vested interest in beach property as well. So that's another issue that we want to talk about with Mr. Blair Adams this morning also. These are issues that we have to continue to discuss. Now, on the first issue, and I think I have about 5 minutes before we go to commercial break. On the first issue was the UK's response to disasters in the overseas territory. And I took the opportunity to look at the communique that was issued after the Joint Ministerial Council in the United Kingdom last year. Now, just for those of you who may not be aware of it, the Joint Ministerial Council is an offshoot, or it replaced what was then called the OTCC, Overseas Territories Consultative Committee, where the leaders in the overseas territories, either premiers, chief ministers, would go to the UK, sit with ministers there, and discuss the relevant issues that the overseas territories face. Normally, before that meeting takes place, there is a pre-Joint Ministerial Council or a pre-OTCC meeting where the overseas territories, not only the Caribbean overseas territories, but the Falkland Islands, Pitcairn, and several others also get together to discuss issues of common interest, and then we then have this big discussion in the UK. Initially, when it started out, it was basically a lot of shop talk, and the United Kingdom basically drove the narrative and the conversation. That has changed considerably, but there are still those who question whether or not we get sufficient benefit from these joint ministerial council meetings as well. Certainly, there is room for improvement in relation to those. So when we look at the communique that was issued in 2017, and the meetings took place on the 28th and 29th of November 2017, the joint communique addressed issues of self-determination, the constitutional relationship between the UK and its overseas territories, disaster recovery, environmental and climate change, exit from the European Union, which Brexit, which is a big issue as well, and will certainly have an impact on the overseas territories, developing tangible changes for the overseas territories and their citizens, beneficial ownership and tax transparency, that was discussed as well, anti-corruption, governance, human rights, and child safeguarding, health, as well as health. That's the last one. So what I want to focus on when we return from this commercial break is the issue of disaster recovery, because that is top on the agenda in some of our overseas territories now. Anguilla, in particular, more importantly, in the British Virgin Islands, because they are in a constitutional situation now with the United Kingdom, to the extent that the United Kingdom has drafted, in order for the BVI to obtain financial aid in terms of recovery, the UK has drafted legislation and has sent it to them for it to be approved in their legislature. We will talk more about that when we return from this short commercial break. Good morning and welcome back to For the Record. Remember, phone lines are open. We will have open mic for a while until we have our guests here with us, and then we would basically like to stick to some of the topics that I spoke about earlier. But if you have other issues that are on your mind, then certainly please feel free to call in to talk about those. As I promised that we would look at the joint communique that was issued after the Joint Ministerial Council meeting that took place in November of 2017 in the United Kingdom. And one of the topics in that communique had to do with disaster recovery. And I will read verbatim from the communique. And it's bullet point number 4. Says the UK and the overseas territories reiterated a message of support and solidarity with the British Virgin Islands, Anguilla, and the Turks and Caicos Islands in the wake of Hurricane Irma and Maria, the strongest ever seen in the Caribbean. We applaud the courage and resilience of the people of the affected territories. We acknowledge the important UK contribution to the response effort through the effective deployment of Royal Fleet Auxiliary Mounts Bay to BVI and Anguilla, and deployment of military personnel, aid experts, and rapid deployment teams across the territories, representing a total investment of £62 million in relief. We also applaud the important support offered by Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, the Falkland Islands, and Gibraltar through provision of personnel, supplies, equipment, and funds for recovery, underlining the close cooperation and mutual affection that exists between the territories. We acknowledge the important role played by neighboring Caribbean states and regional organizations in the relief effort. The UK reiterated its commitment to work in partnership with governments of the affected territories to put in place plans and structure for longer-term reconstruction and sustainable economic recovery. The UK committed to assisting the overseas territories in their recovery to increase their future economic resilience. We underlined that the commitment to developing resilience applied in all territories. We welcomed the recent announcement for a further £15 million of UK support for early recovery after the hurricane, which is delivering accelerated power reconnection, support to prisons, repairs to airports, and assistance for policing, and the Prime Minister's announcement of a further $70 million in grants and up to $300 million in loan guarantees to support long-term reconstruction in the territories worst affected. And I want you to take note of that portion there that talks about £3 million in loan guarantees for the territories that were affected the worst by that, because that's the challenge that the British Virgin Islands are now facing. The communique goes on to say, we discuss the important role played by the private sector in driving economic recovery, including in supporting training and development and making available appropriate insurance. We further reiterated the importance of all overseas territories ensuring they have comprehensive national risk assessment exercised, national risk assessments, disaster preparedness policies and processes in place, that these are regularly exercised, revised, and modified where needed to ensure they remain fit for purpose. The UK reiterated its continued commitment to providing technical expertise and support for capacity building. So that's the joint communique that was issued in relation to disaster recovery by the UK and its overseas territories. Now, we're here in April. The first week in April, hurricane season fast approaching. Where are we with it? What has been done since then, since all of the promises that have been made? We see some overseas territories, they will be facing the next upcoming hurricane season, and there are people in some of those overseas territories who still do not have roofs over their heads as well. So they will be facing another hurricane season totally exposed to the elements. Now, I must say that during the course of the discussion last night on Anguilla Radio, that the Anguillans, and in particular Mr. Don Mitchell, expressed his extreme gratitude to the Cayman Islands for the quick response that we made to the needs of the overseas territories, in particular Anguilla. And I made it a point during my contribution to the discussion, the fact that there were instances where the Cayman Islands were underground much earlier, much quicker than in some instances the United Kingdom as well. But the people of Anguilla expressed their gratitude for the assistance given by the Cayman Islands. One of the things that I also impressed upon my colleagues was the fact that, yes, the discussion is about the UK and the UK's response, but we have to stop looking for the UK or looking towards the UK for everything that we need. We need to discuss amongst ourselves a strategy that each overseas territories, with whatever particular resources that they have, how we can pool those resources to be able to assist each other in events of natural disasters or other events as well. I pointed out that the Cayman Islands, we were extremely fortunate not to have been adversely affected by hurricanes in the last hurricane season, which positioned us in, which put us in a much better position to render assistance to our brother and sister overseas territories as well. I know that locally there was a lot of pushback in relation to the assistance that had been rendered to Dominica, in relation to financial assistance as well. And people, some may say rightly so, others may say that it may not have been the time and the place for it, but people compared what was happening in the Cayman Islands in terms of our people, some of them losing their homes, some of them losing their jobs, and whether or not charity should not have begun at home rather than overseas as well. But be that as it may, we were certainly in a better position to assist our overseas territories than many other jurisdictions were, and we certainly did our part, and the people of those territories are extremely grateful for the assistance rendered by the Cayman Islands. We're going to our 8 o'clock news. Now, please stay tuned. We hope to have Mr. Billy Adams with us as soon as we return from the news break. Good morning and welcome back to For the Record. As promised, Mr. Billy Adam is here with me. I promised you that he would be here after the news as well. And before I get into the discussion again, I want to say good morning. Welcome to For the Record, Mr. Billy. You call in all the time. I think this is the first time that I'm actually having you here in person, but it is good to have you here. And I want to thank you for suggesting my participation in the talk show with our counterparts in Turks and Caicos, Anguilla, BVI, as well.
Yes, sir. It was nice to hear your voice on there last night. And thank you very much for having me.
Okay. Now, before we went to the news, we were talking about the UK and the British Virgin Islands, and they had something called the BVI Recovery Act. It was a piece of legislation that was written, prepared by the UK, sent to the BVI, and they basically said, here it is, you passed this in your legislature, and it is intended, once that is passed, for them to be able to access funds. Now, I'm looking at an article here also that says UK territories eligible for development aid. And after the hurricane, because what the UK didn't point out at one point in time was the difficulties that they were having in terms of being able to render aid to their overseas territories the way that they wanted to. Of course, no one told us that they were ever in that position before, and they should have seen it coming. It had to do with, it says now, Britain will now be able to spend official development aid on hurricane-hit islands after changes to international rules agreed in Paris. It says during this year's hurricane season, the UK government was not able to release funds to its Caribbean territories as they were deemed too rich. But the body that sets rules on aid said money could be spent when catastrophic humanitarian crisis hit. The International Development Secretary described it as a real step forward. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, ruled on Tuesday that aid could be used for short-term help for middle-income countries. Under current OECD rules, some of the small island nations in the Caribbean that were hit by Hurricane Irma last month were unable to receive official development assistance known as ODA because their national incomes are too high. The OECD's Development Assistance Committee rejected a UK plan for small island states to be allowed to waive the rules in emergency. But instead, the 30-member countries backed a different plan to use official aid in temporary emergencies, but on the crucial condition that no overseas development agency aid is diverted from existing recipients in the process. So again, to a certain extent, overseas territories were treated as second-class citizens in terms of what they could. Now, I also referred to the Joint Ministerial Council meeting that took place, I think it's the 28th and 29th of November 2017 in the UK. And at that joint ministerial meeting, for the first time, it says here, ministers from the following departments also attended: Department for International Development, Her Majesty's Treasury, Health and Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And this, they say, demonstrates the UK's government commitment to a whole of government approach to supporting the territories. Because at one point in time, everything was the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So we now see the Department for International Development being included, because that is where now apparently funds can be funneled through based on this OEC decision as well. But the rhetorical question, Mr. Adams, is that we have upcoming hurricane season. Where are we with these plans? The BVI still struggling to get aid. The UK has prepared a bill. It's called the BVI Recovery Act, written, prepared by the UK government, sent to the British Virgin Islands, and they said, here, you pass this in your legislature. Now, there was a whole big debate about it. There were talk about, is this the time that we really need to split from the UK or whatever, because the way they're setting up an agency, and the agency is stacked in such a way that between the governor and the UK, they have full control over it. So elected members in the British Virgin Islands are now arguing that, you know, the fact that they're elected officials and they're playing a minor role in this. We saw something similar in the Cayman Islands when we didn't have provisions for a national emergency to be declared. So everything was in the hands of the governor, and our elected members, there were leaders of law firms and stuff like that. The meetings were taking place in their offices, and they were controlling everything, and our poor elected leaders were sitting in the background with their hands tied until they decided to rebel and say, no, this is not the way that this is supposed to go. So we learned our lessons from that as well. So what is going to be interested in the case of the BVI now is that they have passed a bill, but it has been amended. So they've said to the UK, this is what you sent us, this is what we're sending back to the governor. We don't know the results of that yet. It'll be interesting to see whether or not the governor will be authorized to assent to that particular bill, or whether or not there's going to be a confrontation with the UK in terms of what they have sent and what the BVI legislators have in turn proposed as well. But when we look at the overseas territories, a lot of the blame must lie squarely on the shoulders of our elected officials. You know, accountability, transparency in government, all of those things that are needed. The BVI facing a serious issue, and you can understand why, to a certain extent, the UK, it's taking the approach that they're taking. 1.8, I believe, or $1.9 billion in spending, and no audit has been done for I forget how many years. With that sort of approach to governance, can you blame a country who's going to then provide you with financial aid, with loans, not to want to have some control over how those monies are going to be dispersed? You can't blame them to a certain extent, you know, for it. So some of the blame must lie squarely on the shoulders of the elected officials in the BVI. Your comment, sir.
I agree with what you're saying there, and the situation in the BVI reminds me somewhat of when they had the telecommunications law in 2001. You might remember when that came out.
Yes.
And or people thought they were smart in the Legislative Assembly, and they changed the bill from the way the UK wanted it for the tapping of phones. And for a year it sat, and the governor says, I'm not signing it. I'm just not going to sign it. And finally it went back to the LA, and then they put it the way the UK said it has to be before we will sign the bill. So that is only putting into effect what is in Section 31, 81, and 125 of our Constitution. Because in 3 different places, it very clearly says who is in charge. And our Legislative Assembly really can only do what the UK will allow them to do. That's all it is. There's not a sovereign Legislative Assembly. And because of that, we're faced with these situations. And yes, and it was interesting to listen to the other islands last night talk, because Anguilla is in a pickle of a mess financially as well. They've had obviously corrupt governance for a number of years, decades. Mr. Ronald Webster, who led the revolution back in 1967, must be rolling in his grave. I read his speech that he gave on his 80th birthday for the way that he would like to see Anguilla go. And it's sad to see what has happened to the political regimes that they've had in Anguilla since then. They're just going down and down the tube of debt, more debt, more debt. And they're expecting a bailout by the UK for when they don't want to be accountable what they do with the money. And here in Cayman, I think the best thing that has ever been done for us by the UK is the Framework for Fiscal Responsibility, which is the UK brand name for rules-based fiscal budgeting, which started in the Nordic countries from back in the late 70s and early 80s, when they found themselves in a pickle of a mess financially. And the sovereign wealth funds and the reserves in those countries now is way ahead of any other country because of the way they manage their money and manage a budget.
Precisely.
It burns a hole in their pocket. And here, leading up to the election and in the last several years, when Minister Archer was trying to build up the reserves so that we could be able to pay off, I call it the debt bomb, they call it the bullet bond, but I call it the debt bomb, when that explodes in 2019, to be able to pay it off. And he was trying to build up reserves, but our people, so many politicians and citizens in our island, if they have money in the bottom of their pocket, it burns a hole. They feel that they must be the best consumers out. And even we have some politicians don't want us to be savers. They want us to be spenders. Run up the credit card debt, do whatever you can. Let's keep consumption up, consumption up. That's the key, which is I'm going to use the word stupid. When you don't have reserves, individual family reserves, individual business reserves, and individual country reserves. You pointed out last night in your talk that the fortunate position that we were in 2004 by actually having some reserves in there to be able to meet the expenses after Ivan, which helped in the recovery, which those other territories don't have.
And having a balanced budget as well, so that we could, those funds that we had earmarked for various things, education or whatever, we could take those and divert them towards the recovery, the recovery process, without having to go deeper into debt. So, for instance, the education department was told, do what you have to do in terms of getting the schools back up using the funds that you have. Now, there was some question marks about accountability and accounting for that later on, and many government departments used the excuse, well, we weren't able to have proper records because
proper
of Hurricane Ivan, because we had to do what we had to do. And I think we've gotten over that by now.
We have, and I mean, and we all know and accept the fact that some of the money was not spent honestly, and that there were tricks and that were going on at the time. And that's just a statement of fact. We're not going to be able to ever correct that.
Right.
And those that were responsible for it will never come to justice for it, at least not on this earth. And so in listening to their situations down there, the things that we have had here, like freedom of information, where we can get some information. And like here, where politicians, several politicians do not support freedom of information. They fight against it whenever they can. And with the lumping together of what has happened with the Complaints Commission and all that, that is not good for democracy. That's not good for accountability. That's not good for transparency. It's bad what has happened. That's the only word for it. It's terrible. But down there, they don't even have the semblance of a freedom of information.
Precisely.
Their politicians fight against it. And as you mentioned already, the audited accounts. It's so important that we support to the hilt our Auditor General in the work that they do.
And
they're fighting for us, but
and
yet
Public
still Public Accounts Committee.
Yes.
The Public Accounts Committee that we have today is the first functioning Public Accounts Committee in the Cayman Islands that I can remember. Maybe my short-term memory doesn't allow me to remember any that have been, but I think it is the first functioning Public Accounts Committee that's doing a job. And yet still we see that there has been an attempt to try and shut down the Public Accounts Committee and stop the work that they're doing. And that work is only for the benefit of current and future generations of Caymanians, to be sure that you are getting maximum value for the dollars that are spent in your name.
Okay, we're going to take a commercial break now, folks. Please stay tuned. When we return, the conversation will continue with my guest, Mr. Billy Adam. Good morning and welcome back to For the Record. Remember, our phone lines are open. If you want to participate in this conversation, you may simply prefer to listen, because some of this may be new and interesting to you as well. We're focusing at this point in time on some of the overseas territories, in particular Anguilla and the British Virgin Islands. To some extent, we will talk about the Turks and Caicos Islands, as well. Now, in the case of the BVI, it is estimated that they suffered some $3.6 billion in damages. Now, I'm not sure whether or not that $3.6 billion is in EC dollars, US dollars, or what. We know that the damage here in the Cayman Islands was also in the billions of dollars as well. So the $300 million that the UK is providing in terms of, actually it's $400 million loan guarantee. Out of that, let's see what it says there. Access to £400 million in loan guarantees and £10 million in grants from the United Kingdom. So you have a combination of loan guarantees and grants, and it is not surprising that they have linked the two together. You don't get the $10 million in grant if you don't take up the the loan guarantees as well. And the UK, in terms of wanting to ensure that they have some control over that's done. Now, so after weeks of public debate, they eventually voted 10-2 in support of an amended Virgin Islands Recovery and Development Agency Act 2018. I will look to see if we can find exactly what those amendments entailed and provide that later on as well. But I know, Mr. Billy, that you want to talk about the dialogue that needs to continue to take place between the overseas territories. Last night, again, I pointed out the fact that we have to stop looking towards the UK to see, what the UK can do for us, and we have to start looking and thinking about what we can do for ourselves and each other, absent the UK.
Exactly, and goes back to sort of the ideas of what President Kennedy in that memorable speech that he made in '61. And so it's, what can we do for ourselves? How can we prepare? How can we make our islands more accountable to ourselves, for ourselves, and just internally? And they recognize it. A lot of the citizens over there and the leading minds and the people involved recognize it, but unfortunately, the type of governance system that they have and that we have, at the end of the day, the politicians of the day is who really control just about everything that goes on. And the people really have very little say in what happens. We have a sort of a referendum in our constitution now, provisions, but it's not really a true referendum. We were shortchanged on that, the way it's been drafted. One day maybe we can discuss how we were shortchanged. But they have no mechanism, the people, of bringing change by the people. And until we get that sort of accountability where people of a country, of a jurisdiction, can effect change when things start to really go off the track, as it is in some of the other territories. We're going to end up eventually, sometimes maybe like what happened in Turks and Caicos, where the British government went in. And that is a repeat of, for instance, what happened in Jamaica in 1866, when they had full internal self-government up to that point in time. And then, of course, you had the Morant Bay Rebellion, which wasn't a rebellion. It was a massacre that was done, and they recalled Governor Eyre, took him back to England. He was supposed to be tried for murder, but then he disappeared in the woodwork somewhere, and that never happened. But they went back to full colonial rule in 1866, and it wasn't until 1944 that Jamaica got another constitution, and that was a full-fledged colonial constitution similar to what we have. And that's why it's so important. I get back to freedom of information, the Complaints Commissioner, the standards in public life, which our people cannot bring in because of the fear of some of the people that are involved in governance that they're going to get caught by the net. And so they should, because that's what poor governance does when you're afraid of being caught in this net, because we know the favoritism that goes on. We see the evidence, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. Well, it just might be a duck. And these are the situations that are facing us here. And standards in public life needs to come forth. We need to separate out the freedom of information yet again. And we need to look at how we can have more and more accountability in our governance systems. And when our ministers go off and they have these discussions with the ministers of other territories, and when they talk, how much detail do we really get of what they discussed? They used our money. All of those meetings are kept pretty well secret. No minutes are published. No real report of the subjects discussed. We don't really know what is being done. They give some sort of overall press statement with about 3 or 4 paragraphs, and that's it. They should come on this show, and they should explain what they discussed, why they discussed it, because our people are not taught civics. They're not taught the way governance works. So when they get into the voting booth, a lot of the times the voting is really just on it's on personalities. You're not voting one policy or principle against another policy or principle that's put forward by somebody else. And that's really what should be taking place when people are expressing a vote, not just a personality of the person or what that person is going to do for them, how big their turkey is going to be, how big their ham, or all the other things that we know, the fridge and the stove and all the rest of it.
Yeah. Mr. Billy, if we are at some point in time, and I'm trusting that it'll happen, to move a step further constitutionally, how is it possible for us to do that if we do not have those institutions that support democracy, if we don't have all of those in place? Because at the end of the day, those institutions are the ones that will keep elected members in check. If we don't have those in place, we have freedom of information, we have a Data Protection Act, we have a complaint, we have an ombudsman now and everything, but there are still several that are missing. Those that have to do with the integrity of politicians that make them accountable. If we're going to make that next step forward, the people of these islands must have the comfort to know that you will not have a politician who will basically become a Rambo and become a dictator by having those institutions that support democracy in place.
I fully agree with you. And also, our whole system here of the appointment of boards, it's all political, largely political. And even you see right now there's a case that's heading to the court where you appoint an appeal board to make a decision on promotions, and when the government wishes was not carried out in the facade of a board that's supposed to function independently, when they don't do what the top people say, well, then they say, okay, we're going to take them to court because they don't agree with it, because the system, again, is rigged to give those that are in control, to keep them in control, but to convince the public that we have these independent boards that are out there making decisions. And if you're on the computer there, you can bring up our penal code and look at section 100, 119, and 121. And it is a crime, you will read there, for a minister to pick up any board or any board member and say, pass this one, reject this one, or do this particular act. And also those that are responsible to make decisions, if they don't make decisions, then there's jail time. And we have the same thing, what has occurred in the matter of the registration of the right-of-ways, where the affidavits were submitted in 2001. You might want to take a look at that, and you see the checks, and we didn't need the anti-corruption law. We already had it in our penal code, but it's never been used. Never been used. And it should be used. If nothing else, it should be used on this right-of-ways issue, because it has been there. And the submission was in 2001, and the government never responded until 2017. In 2003, Lands and Survey did a report. In that report, it states that they're taking into consideration matters that are not included in the outside of the parameters of the prescription law and outside of the parameters of section 138 of the land registry law. That's illegal. It's illegal. You cannot make a decision on something that's not covered by the law under which you're supposed to be making the decision. And people should go to jail for it, which is what the penal code calls for. So if when you're talking about the checks and balances and moving forward into self-governance, if you look at Dominica, which was also hit bad by the hurricanes, and you start to follow some of what's been going on down there, it's another example of poor governance. And you ask what would happen when you don't have the checks and balances. Well, there are many examples in the colonial islands and countries when they got independence, because they weren't prepared for it. You can think of Grenada, you can think of Dominica's been going through, Trinidad. They've all gone through a rough time, and of course our neighbor in Jamaica next door. A friend there, Trevor Monroe, produced a good video recently talking about corruption and how it holds back and has held back the progress of Jamaica. And yet still, if we examine and look at the way the UK treated the white colonies, that's New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Newfoundland, and South Africa, which they thought would always be white, and Bermuda. That's the reason why Bermuda has the constitution it has today. Yes. Because it got a constitution. They thought that the whites would always be in control in Bermuda, and they gave them the same constitution because they were so closely linked with business-wise and culturally with the UK in Bermuda that they thought they would always be the same, and they gave Bermuda the same constitution that those other countries that I named got. And as New Zealand developed through the different stages of managing their own affairs, New Zealand doesn't have an Independence Day. One day they just said, well, we're independent. But we didn't go through the whole process that went through in Africa and the other colonies with rebellions and all that. Precisely. Yes. They were given. Yep. And they developed along those lines.
Okay. And so we're going to take a commercial break now. When we return, the conversation will continue with Mr. Billy Adam. Please stay tuned. Good morning and welcome back to For the Record. In the studio with me this morning, Mr. Billy Adam. You hear him calling in on the talk show at times. Some people will label him as a political activist. He just likes to keep government in check, keep government honest as well. I have been looking on the various websites in the BVI to see what the amendments to the Recovery Act, what they actually were. And so far, I have not been able to find anything in that regard. It says here in one article, the Virgin Islands will accept the United Kingdom's offer to guarantee up to £300 million in loan funding for the territory's recovery. House of Assembly members decided on Tuesday night by voting 10-2 in favor of passing the Recovery and Development Agency Act, which establishes the independent recovery fund controlling body required by the UK for its guarantee. The bill's passage came after a contentious public and backroom debate that cut across party lines and appeared to split government's front bench and back bench into two disparate factions. In the end, however, only government backbenchers Mitch Turnbull and opposition member Julian Fraser voted against the bill. Mr. Turnbull's fellow backbenchers, Dolores Christopher, spoke passionately against the bill during the debate, but was absent from at the roll call. The loan guarantee means the UK will assume the Virgin Islands recovery-related debt obligations should the territory default. Okay, that is important. That phrase there is important. The loan guarantee means the UK will assume the Virgin Islands recovery-related debt obligations should the territory default. The UK wants to ensure that the BVI does not default on its loan obligations. So that is why they have put measures in place and they have stacked the board that will control the disbursement of funds with their own people, the governor's nominees as well as those of the UK government, to ensure that that does not happen. And you cannot blame the UK if they're putting up the money. Now, my view is that the overseas territories, the BVI, should not have to go to the UK to seek loan guarantees. If the overseas territories are part and parcel of the UK, remember now they changed us, we were called dependent territories at one point in time, and they felt that, well, that was derogatory. We have a partnership here. So then they decided to call us overseas territories, but we're part of the UK. So if some county in the UK were to experience a natural disaster, wouldn't the UK government support them and ensure that there was a clean process for the recovery? So my point is, my argument is, it shouldn't be loan guarantees. The UK should be given money to the overseas territories without any strings attached in terms of repayment. Yes, it has to be spent wisely, but without any strings attached whatsoever to it. If we're a part and parcel of them, why should we be obtaining grants from them? Why should we be obtaining loan guarantees from them for something that was no fault of our own, a natural disaster? Yes, the fault is that some of those overseas territories were not prepared financially to deal with that, and we have learned our lessons from that, and we want to encourage our politicians here in the Cayman Islands to ensure that we have well-balanced budgets and that we have a reserve fund that we can tap into, that we have a robust insurance industry that they are well regulated, so that at the end of the day, when there's a recovery issue, an emergency issue, they don't try to pull out at the last minute and leave us stranded. We want to ensure that all of those measures are in place. That is what allowed us, in addition to the private sector assistance, that was what allowed us to recover after Hurricane Ivan. Now, some of you will argue there are still structures that are still standing after Hurricane Ivan and nothing has been done with those, but those may be for other reasons as well. But I think we can all admit that the Cayman Islands, we're probably 99.9% recovered from the ravages of Hurricane Ivan. Mr. Billy.
Yes, I mean, our recovery here has been very, very good. There are still some signs. Still see some light poles leaning different places. Those marks are there.
Mm-hmm.
But we did better than some of those other territories have done and are doing. And it shows that for all the work that has been done to try and move us, and we have to give credit where credit is due to various administrations as we have come along, introducing more checks and balances and introducing more access to information. But we cannot relax to think that what we have is sufficient. We must know that we're just on the road to get to where we're going.
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
What you're talking about, aid, as an example, in Florida, when they were hit by the hurricane that went right from south to north, the federal government stepped in and assisted once you declared a disaster area. It's a whole different thing than you have a regular budget deficit and losses, because the city of Detroit, for instance, declared bankruptcy. And they're trying to come out of it. But you had other areas in the U.S. where the federal government, the economy went bad and different things happened, and they didn't step in. Those places were allowed to go down, which of course is what should have happened when the banks, with all the crookery that they did, and the financial industry back in 2007 and 8, some of them should have been just allowed to fail. And if you take a look at countries like Iceland, they let them fail. The people didn't have to pay for the corrupt business practices, and a lot of pressure was put on Iceland, but they're much better off for taking the stand that they took.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the dialogue between the overseas territories, the need for a continuing dialogue, not only amongst our leaders, but amongst the populace as well.
And amongst the populace is the most important part for us to begin to realize that a lot of the political situations that exist in the overseas territories are too similar in some respects, and it's not similarities that are good. And the responsibility, which is what some of the speakers last night spoke about, the responsibility for good governance in the Constitution remains the responsibility of the United Kingdom. And unfortunately, the United Kingdom has failed to ensure good governance in various territories, and here too, from time to time. They just sit back and they allow the train to wreck. They take their hands off the control, the guidance, like in Peter Pan, cricket that sits on the shoulders of,
Yes.
and to say, well, watch out, or in Pinocchio, say, watch out what you're doing, but they just have nothing to add. Here's what's happening, and if they do, they might say it behind closed doors, but the public doesn't realize the guidance that they're giving. And even the UK, every decade or so, they have a parliamentary committee that looks at the way the FCO is managing the overseas territories. I think 2010 was the last one. The report there blasts the FCO for the failures in managing the affairs of the overseas territories to keep them straight. And to allow whatever very evident, some of the things that have gone on that are not good for the people in the overseas territories. I don't know if you've ever read that report, OC, but it's a damaging report.
No, I haven't read that one yet. You'll have to ensure that I get that one to read that.
And of course, the UK Parliament also told the government that the overseas territories should not be in the FCO. We should be in the Home Office.
Right, yes.
We're neither foreign or Commonwealth.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So they have us in a wrong place totally, because the attitude of the way they treat foreign and Commonwealth is not the attitude that they should have in treating a home country, which is what we are, a home jurisdiction, like Isle of Man, Isle of Wight, Channel Islands,
Mm-hmm.
and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
We're different, we're separated, we're not part of the big metropolis of the UK itself, but they need to treat us differently than either being foreign or Commonwealth.
Okay, now I think I can quickly have enough time to go over some of the details in this recovery and development agency details. I found something on it. It says here the agency's board would consist of 7 to 9 people, with a chairman and a deputy chairman appointed by the governor in consultation with the premier. So remember now, in consultation as opposed to on the advice of. So all he has to do is consult. I consulted you, but I still made
Don't
the
have to
decision
follow anything.
that I made, right? So with the premier, according to the draft bill that was gazetted earlier this month, Cabinet would appoint the rest of the members, including one chosen by the governor, one chosen by the premier, one chosen by the UK government, one civil society representative, one donor organization representative, and one private sector representative. Now, Cabinet would appoint these, but they're only appointing persons that have been recommended to them. So it's not like they have a choice over who those individuals will be as well. It says the board would select a chief executive officer who would be subject to approval from Cabinet to run the day-to-day operations. The board would also appoint a chief financial officer and any other staff deemed necessary for the agency's operation. Remember now, that is a board that is already dominated by persons appointed by the governor and by the UK government as well. This CFO would be required to submit account details and budget estimates to the board, which would then be required to submit these documents to Cabinet. Cabinet, in turn, would be required to lay them before the House of Assembly according to the bill. I will continue to read about this agency when we return from our 9 o'clock, when we return from our 9 o'clock headline news. Please stay tuned for the record. We'll be back shortly. Good morning and welcome back to For the Record. In the studio with me this morning, Mr. Billy Adam. We're discussing governance and accountability in the overseas territories. We're discussing the role of the United Kingdom government in recovery efforts in the overseas territories, in particular Anguilla, British Virgin Islands, to some extent Turks and Caicos as well. And we're drawing some comparisons also to what has occurred here in the Cayman Islands after Hurricane Ivan, as well. Another part of the agency that is being set up in the British Virgin Islands, the agency, which has a 5-year life cycle, would also be required to set up a charitable trust to receive all recovery and development contributions channeled through them to the appropriate projects and programs laid out in the territory's official recovery plan. So what they basically have done is they have sidelined the elected government in relation to the handling of these funds and have set up an agency that is dominated by UK and UK governor appointed members as well. I want to compare that to Cayman Islands after Hurricane Ivan. There were two entities that were established. We had the recovery fund that was run through the Development Bank, CIDB, and I, along with Mr. Samuel Rose, our current cabinet secretary, were involved in that process, vetting applications. We hired contractors or persons who knew the construction industry, who knew the planning process and everything. We hired them to go out to vet applicants, and they were allowed to receive up to $15,000 Cayman Islands dollars to basically have their homes enclosed, windows, roof on, and everything, and have them dried in. Now, we had a struggle with that as well, because you had to be policing people, because some people were striking deals with contractors to charge a certain amount, and then they would pocket the rest of the cash. So we had to be on our toes in relation to that. And it worked out pretty well. In addition to that, we had the Cayman Islands Recovery Fund that was established because we know that the private sector did not want to give elected government officials control over certain funds. So they established this recovery fund that was chaired by the governor, had government representation on it as well, but it was comprised mainly of the private sector. They hired their own manager and everything. Dr. Mark Laskin, I believe his name was. At the time he worked there. I think Miss Angela Martins, worked there as well. But all of the private donations were funneled through there. Now, people who compared what the government did and what the private sector did, it was much more onerous to get your applications processed through the privately funded recovery fund. You had to jump through a lot of hoops in order for it to happen. Also, bearing in mind that the government put $5 million into that fund itself. They did have a representative on there in the form of the leader of government business at that time, the Honorable D. Kurt Tibbetts. But it was basically controlled by the private sector. So we had two funds operating at the same time, one by government, and that one moved much faster, despite the fact that, like I said, we had to be on our P's and Q's in relation to monitoring what was going on. And the other fund that also, eventually, I think we got, was it 3-point-something million, or may have been more than that, from the European Union as well. And of course, when you get funds from the European Union, it comes with very, very strict controls, very, very tight controls as well. But we were able to weather the storm. I apologize for that pun, but we were able to weather the storm and get the Cayman Islands back on its feet to recovery. So there can be lessons learned from the other overseas, from our experience by the other overseas territories as well. But first and foremost, we must be prepared from a budgetary standpoint for these occasions when they arise. We have to build up those funds incrementally every year, set aside money, because sooner or later it's going to happen. Now, we talk about Hurricane Ivan being a 100-year storm. There's no guarantee that will happen. We could be, God forbid, we could be hit in the next hurricane season. We hope it doesn't happen, but we have to be prepared for that. Mr. Billy.
What you're talking there is the reality of what we're facing. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't involved, and nor do I know any of the intricate details of the way the funds were managed. I just remember that it seemed when the private sector one was finished with this Dr. Laskin that there was some question marks, many question marks, even with all the checks and balances. And unfortunately, it's a fact of life that wherever you have money, it's like flies go into honey, and you find corruption follows unless you're very fortunate to hold it honest. What I think you're talking there in preparation is, having the equivalent of flood insurance, but to have straightforward hurricane insurance and have it funded. Now, since Hurricane Ivan and the other disasters, I know that there are many, many people that had hurricane insurance before no longer have hurricane insurance on their homes.
Mm-hmm.
I sometimes ask myself when I see the reconstruction being done, how short-term can the memories be? On South Sound there have been some developments, and within 100 yards of one another. One is below the beach ridge, the ground floor. 100 yards up the road, their ground floor is like 16 feet above sea level.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that comes from the fact that really we do not have a development plan. It got thrown out in 1975, and then it got thrown out again when we nearly had one before the coup on November the 8th, 2001. And I'm convinced that one of the reasons that coup occurred was because of the development lobby that saw how close that Mr. Tibbets was in getting a proper development plan done. And even within the working on his own people within the PPM after that was formed, from then until now, we still don't have a development plan, and they thwarted any of the efforts that he made to have a proper development plan. And the current PPM regime, or the unity government, there's no talk of it putting in a development plan, and that is another violation of the law. The law says you're supposed to review it every 5 years. 1997.
Okay.
20 years.
Yep.
And we haven't had a review that's been done. And nobody's gone to jail for violating that section of the law.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions in last night's discussion was, what are the skill sets required to successfully manage the overseas territories in this era? And there were several proposals put forward. I pointed out that we no longer have visionaries like Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Jomo Kenyatta, even here in the Caribbean, people like Michael Manley, Bustamante. We no longer have those. With the qualities that I would like to see in our leaders in this era would be honesty, no conflicts of interest, and they're involved in politics and political leadership because they want to get what is best for the inhabitants of, for instance, the Cayman Islands. What is best for that? In a multicultural society that we're in, you have to have the kind of political leader that will be able to create that balance. You have nationalism on one side, but on the other side, you have to create that balance that you don't marginalize people as well, so that we can build a cohesive society together. That was my viewpoint, and that is what I would like to see in terms of political leadership in this country. I also pointed out that because some persons mention the fact that you need people with legal skills, they need to be economists. I don't believe that you need all of that, because you can surround yourself with people who have those qualities. Leadership is what we need more of. Mr. Billy.
And you remember when Don Mitchell chimed in on that subject?
Uh-huh.
The two of you were singing from the same songbook.
Mm-hmm.
And he gave an example as to how much hope he has in the current premier of Turks and Caicos.
And
I haven't followed
encourage more females to be involved in the political process.
And also, right, and he said, that the men have failed and failed miserably throughout the Caribbean, the male leadership, and that he wanted to see more females become involved because he felt that they tended to have more integrity.
Mm-hmm.
They tended to understand the needs of the people
More compassion.
But compassion with knowledge that you
Yes.
have to balance that with the business side of it, whereas too many of the men are in just for the business side of it, the dollars and cents, and they can't see. Just take a look with our situation, with the way they're trying to push the population of the Cayman Islands to 100,000 as fast as possible. Frankly, it's total madness. And anybody that says, any politician that thinks that it's a good idea, I'm telling him he's crazy. And we need politicians and people that see the need for a proper development plan, a country policy plan, which we were told that we should have from 1991. After what happened in Gibraltar, and the UK government had to bail them out for multi-million dollars, they asked all the territories, please develop a policy plan. We started on the road in 1998 when we came out Vision 2008.
Mm-hmm.
They passed it in the House, and they promptly stored it in the basement of the glass house. And they're non-compliant with it. Little bits here and there people are trying their best to implement. We've seen the same thing with tourism management plan. They run around and have one plan after another, but it's only serving the wishes of the current Minister of Tourism to do what that current Minister of the Tourism wants and the way he wants, not really what the country needs and the people need to advance the people. Because in all of these things, if you do not have, they call it nationalistic, but if you do not have a Caymanian first policy, then who are you developing for? And that question becomes more and more important to be answered. It's not for the people coming out of school when you have 25,000 work permits. Well, there's plenty of jobs for the 900 or 1,000 that are coming out. And when you look at the salary, what the minimum wage is at $6 an hour, that's unrealistic to try and live in our society. At $6 an hour. Should be no less than 10.
Yep. We're going to take a commercial break, and then we will be on the last 15 minutes of the show this morning with Mr. Billy Adam as my guest. Please stay tuned for the record. We'll be back shortly. Good morning and welcome back to For the Record. In the studio with me this morning, I have the pleasure of having Mr. Billy Adam with me, and we're discussing several issues. Now, I don't want you to leave without us talking about the whole issue of beach access. We have to talk about that. That's, again, relevant to the Cayman Islands. And before you came on, I mentioned the video that has been circulating, in relation to the situation in Barbados. And I'm hoping that people are not circulating that for the benefit of amusing themselves, for the amusement part of it, but are taking the issue seriously because it threatens the lack of beach access. This whole question of the high water mark, it threatens our culture, it threatens our future activity or our accessibility to all of the good things about this island and other islands as well, Mr. Billy. We have one caller. Let's grab the caller, Mr. Billy, before we come to you. Caller, good morning. Welcome to For the Record.
Good morning, O.C., and good morning, Billy.
Good morning, sir.
Good show. You're doing a fantastic thing for this island to expose some of the stuff that's going on in this island. We're going back to the talk about the hurricane funds and stuff like that. And I was a part of, not of the hurricane fund, but I was a part of that, appointed by government to go down and look and see, to give some estimates as to damage to buildings and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And my area is from the Westin Hotel, Westin Hotel, the Westway, down Westway. And But I went up also, had to go up to East End and Bordentown and take a look at those places up there. And still today, I think the National Recovery Fund, the National Recovery Fund, which I think everybody thought that was a government thing because it said national.
Mm-hmm.
From the beginning, my opinion was that was a setup to make money for somebody. This guy Laskin, I spoke with him and asked him why certain houses up in Bordentown hadn't been touched. You go there now, you still see little houses that haven't been touched. Nobody fixed them up. People that worked with that Laskin guy, in fact, he left here unbeknownst to anybody. In fact, the governor was on radio on that Carly station there when I think it was Austin might have been in, I don't remember. But anyway, he was on there one day. Mm-hmm. And I asked the governor, then governor, I think whatever his name was there. And I said to him...
That was Governor Dinwiddie at the time.
Dinwiddie. And I met with Dinwiddie in the office then, which was at the All Center in Georgetown, you remember?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
okay. I sat down in front of him and I said to him, with all respect, Your Excellency, I'm concerned about the money we had raised $26 million. You guys remember that was a quote that came from the same Laskin. $26 million to do all this stuff. We could have fixed every house. Forget about houses that had to be under $250,000 or something like that was the thing. And I asked the question, I said, sir, how is it that we have collected $26 million to do this thing, and there's still houses that haven't been touched that need to be fixed? And you know what his words were to me? He never answered the question. He said, well, I'm the chairman of that committee, or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
Billy and O.C., this is what had destroyed Cayman. The love of money, people, greed. When I see, you remember when Mr. Wasserland used to Marcel was in charge of the finances, and he would say to the legislators, we would love to do this, but East End needs a road, West Bay needs a road. You have to decide who's going to get what this time, right? And then he would allocate the money for that, because he always kept a little surplus in the budget for emergencies. Mm-hmm. When I look and I see the money that has been spent on studies about the dock in Georgetown, it seems like none of that was done before was ever looked at again. They had to come up with their own studies. For what?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The money, the millions of dollars we spent. And gentlemen, I can say this.
Quickly.
That this is what has happened to Cayman. Once we put the finances of this country in the hand of the legislators, we got screwed. That's all I can say. Okay. Because everybody and his uncle wants to do this and wants to do that. Look at what we did in the roads about three legislations ago, when they covered the roads all over the place in West Bay, Georgetown, East End, wherever it is, with that cheap asphalt that is nothing but rocks that now eat up your tires. Nobody was held responsible for that, but they got the money. Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is this: until the day we get legislators who say to themselves, it's going to stop, we have here to represent the people.
Thank you very much, caller, for that. We're going to ask you to leave us there. 1992, we had a lot of paving. I remember that government paved themselves out of office, too. They paved themselves out of office, as well, in that particular case. Very quickly, Mr. Billy, beach access. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, let's look at this last weekend, the violation of the laws. Up there by the Red Bay dock, people had been camping in some areas and using that area not only for camping at Easter, but for birthday parties and other areas there, for other celebrations, some of them for over 30 years. The government comes, erects a fence, put trailers, and blocks them from being able to get in there. Mm-hmm. Then I hear this.
But we have to admit that was rectified eventually. The people did have an ability to camp up there for the Easter as well. They
not in the areas where they normally use, no.
Well, I saw tents set up there because they had removed some of the fencing I must admit that during the Easter holidays, I didn't go in that direction. I rode to the east. But it was clear, and I was told that a former legislator said to the people there, listen, you go up there and you camp like you have always done. And they were prepared to face the authorities. But Mr. Austin Harris, on MLA Austin Harris, on this show, did give an undertaking that he would look into it. And my understanding is that they were able to camp out there.
One set of the people that went up there was able to camp in approximately the same area.
Mm-hmm.
The other set of people had to camp in front of the parking lot, get squeezed in there to the west side of the dock with hardly any space.
Okay, I can't challenge you on that because
I can show you the pictures.
Sure.
But the point is that the prescription law is very clear. You've been using something for more than 20 years, Section 2 and Section 4. It is a violation of the law. And the government violated the law when they denied those people the use of the area. And if you look at the West Bay Road, in front of the Kimpton, there is a right-of-way that is blocked with beach chairs and removed. You used to have access to it. People could drive to that. They had a vehicular access to that right-of-way. No longer. The government, without any consideration of all the camping spots and the access ways north of Tiki Beach, going up to what we know as Holman's Corner, where it connects up, government has given that road to DART without making any provision for the public to have vehicular accesses to the vehicular accesses to the beach. And it's enshrined in law. It is just an example of how successive governments, are not considering the needs, cultural, health-wise, everything else, of the Caymanian people.
So what do we do about that? Because I have to admit that there are several people, a lot of people in Cayman I wouldn't go to war with because they wouldn't have my back at the end of the day. We see the videos circulating and stuff like that, but how many of them are prepared to get out there on the front line, take a half day off work or on the weekend or whatever and go out there and publicly show their support for some of these issues?
Mr. O.C. is a good point. But one has to realize when some of the people contact you, the realities of life. They have a home, they have children, they have schools, they have scholarships, they have jobs, many of them with government that go there. This country is a very vindictive society. And if you oppose certain people in government, you're going to pay a price. You're going to pay a price. And they will give up. As I remember in the debate that was in the LA, Minister Archer said that he has stopped going to some of those places because of the way that people are treating. And he doesn't want to be out front to be seen as a protester for the Compass paper to make fun of them. And a lot of people are not just going to do it, they're just going to retreat. But what that is doing, when people retreat from exercising their rights, when they see their rights taken away and they become complacent, rather than being assertive, you're breeding a generation that's going to bypass being assertive and become aggressive. It has happened in society after society after society. That's what the Northern Ireland situation is all about. And if you want, some people, you can Google The Rhythm of Time, Bobby Sands' poem that he wrote when he was on a hunger strike of 80 days before he died in May of 1981. The rhythm of time. There is a thing in every man, my friend, and it rises up. And it will rise up. It quell in one generation, and the next generation realizes how bad their people were treated. And that is what we're seeing it happen, and we don't realize it. We call it crime. And that was the whole purpose of their hunger strike, was because Maggie Thatcher called them common criminals and thugs. And they said, no, we're prisoners of war. This is our liberation we're fighting for. And that's what their hunger strike. And 10 of them starved themselves to death on that one principle.
Yes.
Just call us prisoners of war, what we are. So, back to the beach. The Caymanian people have been abused. The laws have been violated. When they apply for legal aid to fight the case in court, they're told the legal aid department in the courts say that they're not going to give any finance because access to beaches is not in the public interest in the Cayman Islands. That's what the courts are saying. How out of touch can the people be in government when they say that access to public beaches, is not in the public interest in the Cayman Islands to preserve it? Gabby, in 1981, in Barbados, when Jack Dare, who came from St. Vincent, where he allowed the law like they have in Jamaica, where they can put fences all the way down into the sea. And in Barbados, Jack Dare was trying to introduce the law. He became the head of the tourism department there. And he challenged him. And he said, Jack, I'm going to write a song. And Jack Dare didn't believe that he would write what he did when he wrote Jack, the Beach is Mine. And now, last Saturday, on the 31st of March, Gabby was leading. He said he never thought at 72 that he would have to come out and lead a march again to fight for Barbados beaches, because this generation of developers, some of them want to try and take it away.
Yep.
So go on Google and just look Gabby, beach, and Barbados, and you will see all the demonstrations and hear the songs.
And we urge you, don't take it as entertainment. Take it seriously, because we have a lot to learn from that as well. Mr. Billy, I want to thank you very much for making yourself available this morning. I want to thank you also for referring me to your Mr. Sutcliffe in Anguilla.
It was a pleasure.
It certainly was my pleasure to participate in the discussion last night as well. Folks, I want to thank you for allowing Radio Cayman, and by extension For the Record, into your homes, into your vehicles as you traverse the busy roads of the Cayman Islands, into your places of work, whether it be an office cubicle or if you're working in the outdoors. I want to remind you that we are our brothers and our sisters keepers. There is always someone out there who's less fortunate than we are, and I ask you to extend a helping hand to them. If you can't do that, then I suggest you donate to a worthy charity, because we always want to consider those who need, not necessarily those who want or even those who crave. I say to you, have a great day. Continue to support your radio station, Radio Cayman. Join Sterling Dwayne Ebanks at 12 noon for Talk Today. And as usual, we ask the good Lord to bless these three beautiful, wonderful Cayman Islands, where we need to preserve access to our beaches.
Informative, impartial, insightful.
This is your talk show.
1-800-534-8255. Your calls, your input. This is For